Oh, hey there. Recently, I published a stream clip called Marxism-Leninism Doesn't Work, They're Lying to You, from a recent live stream. Arthur Kaufman says, why do you think anarchism is losing the propaganda war against Marxism-Leninism and democratic socialism? Because they are closer to society as it stands. The clip seemed mostly like a repetition of things I'd already said on the channel, though in much more detail elsewhere, which authoritarian leftists had mostly refused to engage with beforehand. I still recommend you go listen to that series of video essays titled "The State is Counter-Revolutionary." However, given that the authoritarian left has largely ignored this essay and refused to respond to it at length, I assume they would ignore the clip as well. It was an off-the-top-of-the-head rant on a live stream, and I had produced entire video essays, as well as shorter videos explaining my stances before. So, imagine my surprise when numerous authoritarian leftist channels made videos criticizing the stream clip. Why did this particular clip upset them so much? We're going to inspect the answer to that question by starting with the most informed and articulate: socialism for all. We will listen to their arguments and address them directly. I disagree with them, however, I respect that they approach the topic by use of theory rather than knee-jerk polemic. So I will use this first part of the video to flesh out the structure of my argument against a good faith opponent. Then later in the video, I will refer to the response by Bad Empanada. Most of what he said will have been addressed already by the earlier portion of this video by the time we arrive. However, he did have some different arguments, which I will get to in time. By the end, I think you'll see that the real reason that there was such a big uproar among authoritarian leftists isn't because the claims I made in the video were mistaken. It's because what I said in the video directly undermines the most common recurring arguments made by authoritarian leftists. They seek to be seen as the cool pragmatists in the room. They want to be thought of as successful. The title of the video directly undermined this mythology and therefore incited a strong response. However, I'm going to demonstrate that what I said in that video was correct, and that I did so with the backing of a great deal of research. If that interests you, stick around. We're going to talk about the theory of capitalism and socialism. Damn, y'all, I just looked at the runtime for this thing, and it's gonna be like 2.5 hours long. So get settled in, grab some popcorn. We've got a lot to talk about. So, I feel like, to begin with, I should introduce myself. I have been organizing since 2011 in response to the 2008 financial crisis. I got my start in Occupy Tulsa, which was the Occupy branch of Occupy Wall Street. Then, after that, I got involved in a variety of different campaigns, including the legalization of medical cannabis here in the state of Oklahoma, and eventually in 2020, I founded the group Cooperation Tulsa. And Cooperation Tulsa is focused on the development of food sovereignty. We own 2.5 acres of land, which we are cultivating. We also develop neighborhood councils. We hold general assemblies, which can get up to almost 100 people. We focus on the development of community defense, teaching people how to use firearms and a variety of other forms of self-defense. We also distribute medical care directly to people who need it. We engage in education programs, which people of all sorts can become part of. The reason why I bring this up is because I'm going to be giving a similar introduction to Socialism for All, and then later in the video, Bad Empanada when he comes up. So to begin with, let's start with Socialism for All. Socialism for All identifies Marxism-Leninism as the most recent evolution of his perspective. Before that, he was a social democrat, but he had an ANCOM phase during Occupy Wall Street. He was in a workers' cooperative, and then eventually he felt that Bernie and Occupy were insufficient. So that's what brought him here. Keep that in mind as we proceed forward.
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. It's late March 2026, and today we're going to take a stab at helping some anarchists to understand Marxism-Leninism better.
So this is something I think occurs a lot when authoritarian leftists try to respond to anarchist concerns. And that is, they assume that the criticisms come from a lack of understanding of Marxist-Leninist ideology. But I've read Lenin and Mao. I've read authoritarian leftists pretty broadly. I've read numerous books on the history of the USSR and Mao's China. My opinions don't come from a lack of understanding. They come from disagreeing with what I read in those works and my own outrage at the betrayal of the revolutions of these countries by Marxism-Leninism and other derivative ideologies. So next he says that social democracy and Marxism-Leninism just aren't comparable.
I would say that there's really no interpretation of Marxism-Leninism or social democracy which would just equate these things. I think that the most charitable thing that you could say in that way is that you would consider the similarities between Marxism-Leninism, communism, and social democracy to be greater than the differences between them, because I don't think that you can in good faith say that there are just no differences.
So I just want to start by saying that it's not really relevant whether either camp identifies that way. Both of these camps do imagine themselves as independent, but from an outside analysis, especially a traditionally leftist economic analysis, they share key characteristics. The following characteristics are those identified by the labor movement of the late 1800s and expounded upon by Marx himself as the key identifying features of capitalism. They are maintenance of wage labor, especially differential wage labor, the alienation of the workers from direct cooperative control over production, and this part is split into 4 categories: alienation from the self, alienation from the process of production, alienation from other workers, and alienation from the product of labor. And the last one I want to note in this list is production for sale rather than need, and this is sometimes called commodity production. These are the metrics that I'm going to be using to identify whether an example is capitalist over the course of this video. The second is that I want to note that Lenin was a self-described social democrat. In fact, he wrote a very notable pamphlet called 2 Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution, and described his tactics as belonging to the school of social democrats. One of the supposedly very important texts of Marxism-Leninism, What is to be Done, is littered with self-descriptions of being social democrats. By him, it is regarded as the necessary revolutionary orientation to change conditions. Quote, "We have said that there could not have been social democratic consciousness among the workers. It would have to be brought to them from without. The history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness, i.e., the conviction that it is necessary to combine in unions, fight the employers, and strive to compel the government to pass necessary labor legislation, etc. The theory of socialism, however, grew out of the philosophic, historical, and economic theories elaborated by educated representatives of the property classes, by intellectuals. By their social status, the founders of modern scientific socialism, Marx and Engels, themselves belonged to the bourgeois intelligentsia. In the very same way, in Russia, the theoretical doctrine of social democracy arose altogether independently of the spontaneous growth of the working class movement. It arose as a natural and inevitable outcome of the development of thought among the revolutionary socialist intelligentsia." End quote. On this point, I'll regard off the bat that at this time, social democrat had a different connotation. It was a name given mostly to revolutionary Marxists. However, it was specifically a name given to those Marxists who did not believe that the masses could be organized by way of their own power, but were instead parliamentarians who believed that an enlightened vanguard must direct the masses. This contrasted them from elements in the movement who were sometimes deemed ultra-leftists, who sought to organize the people within their context. Regardless, this doesn't change the fact that there is clearly an overlap in the history of this phrase social democrat and Marxism-Leninism. The idea that there are these extremely distinct tendencies is just not backed up by history, nor current circumstances. As we proceed, however, I won't be using social democrat in the way that Lenin was using it. I'll use the phrase social democracy to describe a form of bourgeois reaction in the face of revolutionary impulses which seeks to placate the masses with improvements in conditions rather than fundamentally changing the relations of labor to the means of production. Social democracy maintains the fundamental features of capitalism, but uses bribery to satiate the workers' demands, while nonetheless holding firmly to state imperatives. In this sense, social democracy is a way for bourgeois society to stabilize itself in the face of revolutionary threats. I contrast this to the other primary form of bourgeois reaction, fascism, which seeks to crush the social movement rather than to placate it. I won't cover this extensively in this video, though I am writing work on the subject currently. Social democracy, in modern common usage, refers to the use of parliamentary mechanisms to carry out extensive nationalization campaigns, to promote welfare programs to ameliorate the poor conditions of the proletariat, and to empower unions within the context of bourgeois society. What we will show in this video is that the USSR and Maoist China primarily existed within just such a paradigm, and that their brief experiments never wandered very far. Moreover, when these experiments wandered from the mark, they were quickly pulled back into campaigns of market liberalization and the reestablishment of worker alienation. This, I contend, is because they didn't fundamentally escape bourgeois political and economic structures, and were therefore pulled back in by the gravity of these structural errors. Despite this fact, I will not refer to Marxist-Leninists as social democrats in this video. When I mention social democrats for the rest of this video, understand that I'm referring to parliamentary elements within bourgeois society which seek to reform capitalism in the way I described beforehand, but without an insurrectionary break. Think Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and the Scandinavian social democracies. This difference between Marxism-Leninism and social democrats writ large is the most fundamental one. Whereas the modern social democrat maintains bourgeois society within its bounds, the Marxist-Leninist seeks to put in place social democracy through insurrection. Though, as we will discuss, they often resort to use of basic parliamentarianism anyway. So, one of his claims is that social democracy and communism are enemies.
As a communist, though, I would say quite the opposite. The differences between communism and social democracy are significant, and that, in fact, the struggle against revisionism in the communist movement, which is removing revolutionary elements from Marxist ideology, basically has amounted to a battle between communism and social democracy, with sometimes disastrous results. For the building of socialism, it just leads back to capitalism when social democracy gets the upper hand in that struggle. So, without further comment at this time, I object to that point that it's a total mischaracterization.
So, what he's saying here is true, but this is because authoritarian leftists and social democrats alike believe that authoritarian leftists will fundamentally achieve these aspirations of social reorganization. Moreover, social democrats, even if they believe that the authoritarian leftists will achieve social democratic ends, don't believe that this insurrectionary break is necessary. They think it's a dangerous and violent transition which will only bring strife. They believe that simple parliamentary tactics will suffice. Social democrats also believe that this insurrectionary orientation seen within ideologies like Marxism-Leninism and Maoism will cause the workers to shy away from the cause, to give the state opportunities to suppress the movement, and unnecessarily associate the movement with violence and overthrow. In this sense, social democrats will tend to side with the state as it currently exists. After all, as we've said, social democracy is a form of bourgeois reaction. It seeks to maintain the current form of bourgeois society. It's not a program of risk-taking. After the revolution, Marxist-Leninists and other related ideologues simply fill the position of the Social Democrats in the previous order, even if there is a temporary period of rapid transition after insurrection. Next, he says that the Marxist-Leninist transition is easier to imagine than anarchism.
So, is there validity to the idea that Marxism-Leninism and social democracy are closer to capitalism than is anarchism? But just on its face, responding to that idea, I would say to the extent that it's true, it's because social democracy isn't that much of a departure from capitalism, and Marxism-Leninism, which has a transition theory built into it, which maybe makes it easier to understand and imagine.
So I think this is really interesting to note, because this is socialism for all admitting the thesis of my video. Authoritarian leftism never proceeds past this transitional condition, and so when their revolutionary examples are cited, they're easier to understand within the context of the current society. This is a testament to the fact that Marxist-Leninist examples haven't made such enormous leaps outside of bourgeois bounds that they've become incomparable, but instead that they're easily comparable.
The third point is what he called hierarchical realism. In other words, the assumption that hierarchy can't be overcome, a much more equitable society cannot be achieved because of human nature or something like that. Whatever the reasons might be behind that assumption, I have to say I haven't really seen this assumption very much, but this particular point is not one that has really come up much at all. That's just been my experience. What I do see almost all the time in the communist world that I am hosting and participating in discussions in is recognition of the need for a communist party and a socialist state in order to build socialism, repel counter-revolution.
It isn't relevant whether people are saying that they believe hierarchy is eternal explicitly. The assumption is baked into all of the arguments. Similarly, many people believe that capitalism is eternal, and yet they don't make this the primary line of argumentation. Instead, they dance around the idea using arguments which presume the fact, but don't explicitly state that fact. That being said, I've absolutely heard many authoritarian leftists and social democrats make the claim of hierarchical realism explicitly. Even Mao said, quote, "There will always be heads," end quote. Though many authoritarian leftists may profess to believe in a communist society, in practice, their arguments always reproduce logics of hierarchical realism which are contrary to the achievement of communism. The next thing he says is that hierarchy is just temporary during transition.
The communists I know, though, do necessarily recognize that as a temporary necessity while capitalism is being extinguished.
I think this one is kind of frustrating because he's responding to me, who he knows is an anarchist, but anarchists have explained why this cannot be successful so many times that it's just become tedious at this point. However, I'm going to explain once again. Anarchists believe in what is called means-ends unity. Means-ends unity is the claim that the ends that one can achieve are strictly determined by the means that they use to achieve them. As Emma Goldman said, quote, "All human experience teaches that methods and means cannot be separated from the ultimate aim. The means employed become, through individual habit and social practice, part and parcel of the final purpose. They influence it, modify it, and presently the aims and means become identical," end quote. This is why you can't have a single revolutionary break and then the forceful imposition of a new society. The revolution, if it is to succeed in putting a new world in place, must have already created the embryo of that new world within it. That embryo is what will grow to fruition. Such life cannot be forced into existence at the end of a bayonet, or a society of bayonets will follow. So next, he responds to my point about people going from Marxism-Leninism to anarchism, and he says that the pipeline doesn't go through Marxism-Leninism then to anarchism, it's actually vice versa.
But proceeding from this premise, he then goes on to say, that social democracy and Marxism-Leninism are people's first stops before they get to anarchism. My experience has been the exact opposite. What I've seen is people who start out as anarchists or SOCDEMs and then do the reading and then become Marxists. Now, that's anecdotal, but I mean, let us know in the comments what you've seen. That, to me, seems pretty uniform. So again, anecdotal, but I would contest that point because I have almost never seen it go in that direction.
Though it's understandable how one might have this view, given that so many so-called ANCOMs or anarchists become authoritarian leftists, we should first note that there are many, many more social democrats than there are anarchists. And the social democratic orientation is not so different from the Marxist-Leninist one. Many people transition through a SOCDEM phase, then they realize that it's insufficient, and they look to an ideology which seems to be a potent break, and they find anarchism. However, in their transition through anarchism, they don't fully throw off these previous assumptions as social democrats. I myself was once in just such a place. I was a self-described anarchist who was advocating for Bernie Sanders, even going so far as to canvass for him. During Occupy, I was a self-described anarcho-syndicalist, yet I argued for the need for a transitional state and said that capitalism was a useful engine for the development of the economy. If I had, instead of reading anarchist theory to disabuse me of these notions and finally purge my mind of all such social democratic biases, instead chosen to gravitate toward these beliefs, I would likely have become a Marxist-Leninist. In this case, I probably would have argued that I was once an anarchist and became a Marxist-Leninist over time. But having now gone through a long process of ideological development and real-world experience, I can now say that back then, I was only an anarchist in name. Those biases and the lack of earnest belief in the anarchist program meant that if I were to be identified as an anarchist, I was not a theoretically informed one. In other words, most of the anarchists who transition through anarchism to Marxism-Leninism are not deeply studied and theoretically equipped anarchists. They describe themselves as anarchists because of aesthetics, because of loose understandings of individualist anarchist theory, and because of proximity to protesters, who are often self-described anarchists. Here, I think it's important to note something. Socialism for All claims that they were once a self-described ANCOM during Occupy. However, as we saw, they didn't understand one of the most primary theoretical constructs of anarchism: means ends unity. This is a perfect example of what the so-called anarchist to Marxist-Leninist pipeline really entails. We see that Socialism for All never really absorbed and probably never deeply read anarchist theory. They had a variety of uninspected biases which made them susceptible to support for social democracy, a la Bernie Sanders, and because of their lack of understanding of what it meant to be an anarchist, were then susceptible to authoritarian leftist logics. Furthermore, there are many examples of thinkers and movements moving away from Marxism-Leninism toward various forms of libertarian socialism. Murray Bookchin, Ashanti Alston, Lorenzo Gamboa Ervin, and Abdullah Öcalan were all Marxist-Leninists at one point in their careers and subsequently moved to anarchism or libertarian socialism. Other historical thinkers, such as Carlo Cafiero, moved away from Marxism and towards anarchism, as he was disillusioned with state-oriented Marxism. The premise that the pipeline from anarchism to Marxism-Leninism only goes one way is just empirically false.
I'm just going to interrupt here for a second. So he is continuing the train of thought that social democracy and Marxism-Leninism get you the exact same result. I contest that point, and he has not provided a rationale for it that I can respond to. But what I contest again is this idea that the outcome of social democracy and socialism at all points throughout the history since 1917 have been identical. That socialism was never built, that the most there was state capitalism.
So when I was watching Socialism for All's response, I actually watched back through my video to make sure, but I didn't say that these two things were literally identical. The way that these both have manifested has absolutely differed, and that is to say, both have gone through many iterations in different countries, and they've experimented with all kinds of different mechanisms. They've also tended to come from very different social processes. Whereas social democracy tends to arise from parliamentary successes, Marxist-Leninist states tend to arise from coups. However, variation alone is not enough for something to change outside of a category. There are many numbers in the real numbers, yet they are still real numbers. There are many different forms of capitalism, but they are all still capitalism. Pointing to simple differences is not sufficient. You have to demonstrate that the definitional features of capitalism have been eliminated. Otherwise, you're simply placating the proletariat under fundamentally capitalist social, economic, and political systems, which is descriptive of social democracy. In the examples that are the most often pointed to, the USSR, China, Vietnam, and Cuba, all of the features of capitalism have remained. The difference is that these imperatives have all instead been taken up by the state through nationalization campaigns rather than simply being carried out by private entities. This is what is called state capitalism. And I did not invent this term, nor did anarchists more generally. In fact, it was a term of art utilized by all socialists at the time of the labor movement around the turn of the 20th century. The reason I'm stating that social democracy and state capitalism are basically the same is that they share the same basic economic structure. They both placate the proletariat with welfare programs, and they both function on representative forms of government while maintaining the alienation of the proletariat from control over the means of production. And this part is really important, so let's get into it. As Marx said in Critique of the Gotha Program, the capitalist mode of production rests on the fact that the material conditions of production are in the hands of non-workers, in the form of property and capital and land, while the masses are only owners of the personal condition of production, of labor power. If the elements of production are so distributed, then the present-day distribution of the means of consumption results automatically. If the material conditions of production are the cooperative property of the workers themselves, then there likewise results in a distribution of the means of consumption different from the present one. Vulgar socialism has taken over from the bourgeois economists the consideration and treatment of distribution as independent of the mode of production, and hence the presentation of socialism as turning principally on distribution. In other words, you can't transcend capitalism by changing the way that goods and services are distributed within the economy to benefit the people rather than just the bourgeois. You have to change the actual economic structure of society such that the, quote, material conditions of production are the cooperative property of the workers themselves, end quote. Marx added to this in Das Kapital, saying, "The veil is not removed from the process of material production until it becomes the production by freely associated people and stands under their conscious and planned control," end quote. If this does not take place while the conditions stated in this passage, and by me at the beginning of this video, remain, then you haven't transcended capitalism. You've instead turned the state into the national capitalist. This is also not my own contention. Here's Engels saying the same thing in Anti-Düring. Quote, "State ownership does not do away with the capitalistic nature of the productive forces. The more of them the state takes over, the more does it actually become the national capitalist. The more citizens does it exploit. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. The capitalist relation is not done away with." So then we see that nationalization campaigns, revolutionary parties, and welfare programs do not constitute socialism. Instead, they mean that you are still within capitalism, state capitalism to be specific. And unlike the Marxist-Leninists of today, Lenin and Mao made no secret of this fact. In 1921, in Lenin's Tax in Kind, which Socialism for All cites directly, he says, quote, "State capitalism would be a step forward as compared with the present state of affairs in our Soviet Republic. If in approximately 6 months' time, state capitalism became established in our republic, this would be a great success and a sure guarantee that within a year, socialism will have gained a permanently firm hold and will have become invincible in this country, end quote. And then later, quote, no one, I think, in studying the question of the economic system of Russia has denied its transitional character. Nor, I think, has any communist denied that the term Soviet Socialist Republic implies the determination of the Soviet power to achieve the transition to socialism, and not that the existing economic system is recognized as a socialist order, end quote. And what did Lenin mean by state capitalism? He gives a very brief parenthetic explanation. State capitalism, grade monopoly, state-controlled entrepreneurs and traders, bourgeois cooperators. But in this, there's been no elimination of alienation of the worker from the self. They still sell their labor for a wage. Alienation of the worker from the process of production. They still don't control the conditions of their labor. Alienation of the worker from other workers. They still compete with other laborers to please the bosses. Or alienation of the worker from the product of labor. They still don't receive the product of their labor or control its distribution. There was still wage labor and commodity production. As Bakunin noted, when the people are being beaten with a stick, they are not much happier if it is called the people's stick. Indeed, these factors didn't cease in the USSR at any point. In fact, Stalin defended commodity production as late as 1951. Quote, certain comrades affirm that the party acted wrongly in preserving commodity production after it had assumed power and nationalized the means of production in our country. They consider that the party should have banished commodity production there and then. In this connection, they cite Engels, who says, with the seizing of the means of production by society, production of commodities is done away with, and simultaneously the mastery of the product over the producer. These comrades are profoundly mistaken. The same exact program was carried out in China, not just after China's market reforms under Deng, but even during Mao's leadership. In fact, in 1949, Mao said, quote, China must utilize all elements of urban and rural capitalism that are beneficial and not harmful to the national economy. Our present policy is to control, not to eliminate capitalism. In the decades between now and then, there has been no further progress on this accord than these two examples, and therefore there's been no movement out of capitalism by any state project. Next, Socialism for All says that they had to do state capitalism because they had to develop the means of production.
By the way, Lenin did talk about what state capitalism is from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, and you can hear this in an audiobook that we have on the channel called The Tax in Kind. In that document, he discusses the state of the Soviet economy as having 5 overlapping, coexisting economic forms. At the bottom, you had patriarchal peasant subsistence, then you had small commodity production, then you had private capitalism, then you had state capitalism, his term, and then you had a socialist sector also. So, what was state capitalism according to Lenin? Well, in contrast to the private capitalism, it was more orderly, larger scale, and with accounting and other strict controls under regulation of the state. This was a strict kind of control that explicitly the Bolsheviks were looking to outgrow as rapidly as possible. However, following the war, they socialized as much as they could and then left these pieces in place, with Lenin saying that this is the best we can do right now, but that if the state stays in proletarian hands through the party, then they would be able to transition this to socialism, to expropriate it, and to nationalize it under a workers' government, which they did do not long after. And why were they making this strategic retreat in the first place? Aside from the war, it's that Russian industry was not that well developed. So scarcity still existed, natural scarcity still existed.
So this is actually an argument that I address in my work, The State is Counter-Revolutionary. The underlying assumption of this claim is that capitalism is more powerful developmentally than socialism would be. When you say, we had to do state capitalism in order to develop industry, you're saying that capitalism is a superior system when it comes to development. It also entails that socialism will always be susceptible to being defeated by the rise of capitalism once again. Not because capitalism simply seeks to destroy socialism, but instead because capitalism is a superior program of economic development. This is, in fact, an anti-socialist position. The contention of most of the classical socialist theorists is that socialism is a superior system of economic management and development, and that it can become hegemonic once it's established. However, the conception that's presented by Marxist-Leninists is that it's fragile and it can't weather conflict. Also, if the state was forced to make concessions to market imperatives in order to develop the economy, why did it not instead proliferate workers' cooperatives instead of private and state-controlled industry? One will notice that these examples of state control only ever move toward capitalism in the long run. They never try to make movement toward worker control, even when they're in the mood to make concessions to the world as it stands. They would prefer private bourgeois control and state alienation of the workers than they would to create an economy of workers' cooperatives. The reason for this is simple. They were not carrying out these imperatives out of necessity. They were acting to maintain state control instead of creating workers' control. Workers' control is a threat to these supposedly socialist states. Then he claims that partial decommodification has existed in these countries.
But as to these other claims about socialist states never having achieved decommodification or socialism, in socialist countries past and present, partial but extensive decommodification has been achieved, though not in every sector. And yes, people would receive wages, but the labor market as we understand it in a capitalist country did not exist.
In all my studies, I've never seen an example of decommodification taking place in socialist states. I suspect that you mean that they nationalized industries and then carried out direct distribution of some goods and services. For example, during war communism, a great deal of people's food, housing, and other amenities were directly distributed by the state. However, internally, they were still keeping track of values. They were rationing based on scarcity rather than need. This was also considered disastrous, both within the state and by scholars observing it. Fundamentally, this is no different than a welfare program. The NHS is not decommodified healthcare. If Section 8 and council housing were made free, these would not be decommodified housing. These exist under capitalist economic imperatives. Commodity production would remain. Or are we to believe that welfare programs which provide services to citizens free of cost are examples of socialism? Clearly not. This is the vulgar socialism that Marx referred to in his quote above. Quote, vulgar socialism has taken over from the bourgeois economists the consideration and treatment of distribution as independent of the mode of production, and hence the presentation of socialism as turning principally on distribution. Now, what I'd like to do is contrast this to what took place in the Spanish countrysides during the Spanish Civil War, when the anarchists took over a region of 8 million people. I'm going to refer to the same list of characteristics which we stated above at the beginning of this essay. So first, let's address the alienation of the workers from direct cooperative control over production. Gaston Laval both witnessed the Spanish Revolution himself and carried out extensive scholarship after its demise. He said, quote, very quickly, more than 60% of the land was collectively cultivated by the peasants themselves, without landlords, without bosses, and without instituting capitalist competition to spur production. In almost all the industries, factories, mills, workshops, transportation services, public services and utilities, the rank and file workers, their revolutionary committees, and their syndicates reorganized and administered production, distribution, and public services without capitalists, high-salaried managers, or the authority of the state. Even more, the various agrarian and industrial collectives immediately instituted economic equality in accordance with the essential principle of communism, quote, from each according to his ability and to each according to his needs. They coordinated their efforts through free association in whole regions, created new wealth, increased production, especially in agriculture, built more schools, and bettered public services. They instituted not bourgeois formal democracy, but genuine grassroots, functional, libertarian democracy, where each individual participated directly in the revolutionary reorganization of social life. They replaced the war between men, survival of the fittest, by the universal practice of mutual aid, and replaced rivalry by the principle of solidarity. This experience, in which about 8 million people directly or indirectly participated, opened a new way of life to those who sought an alternative to anti-social capitalism on the one hand, and totalitarian, state-bogus socialism on the other." End quote. This description has eliminated all 4 of Marx's forms of alienation, a task that the USSR hardly achieved a quarter of. The CNT-FAI, in its limited purview, eliminated alienation from the self, alienation from the process of production, alienation from other workers, alienation from the product of labor. It has also addressed production for sale rather than need. So what about the maintenance of wage labor, especially differential wage labor? This part of the process was certainly uneven, but when we look at the compromises that were made by the Spanish anarchists, we see something far superior to the state capitalism of the USSR, or China, or Cuba, or Vietnam, or any of the other examples that are commonly used. Sam Dolgoff describes the superior compromises in his work, The Anarchist Collectives. Quote, "In less than 3 years, the libertarian collectives did away with the wage system. Where this was not possible because of the sabotage of the Republican government, the bourgeois, and their socialist and communist allies, they equalized income to the greatest possible extent. This is true of most of the socialized urban enterprises. The revolution instituted the family wage, under which commodities were distributed and services rendered, not according to the amount of labor performed, but according to the number and needs of the family members. Similar arrangements were made for individuals living alone." End quote. And I'll note, of course, that these were not absolutely universal things. These things were instituted in large regions of the areas that the Spanish anarchists had taken control of. However, these were instituted in very large portions of those regions. The workers were the ones who controlled this process, not a bureaucratic body which commanded them. In this way, there was real decommodification at play, even if it wasn't a complete universal, and in this sense it represented an actual socialist transitional stage. By contrast, in the USSR, wages were never fully equalized. In fact, the people who were paid the highest were previous capitalists employed to manage industry. Here's Lenin saying this precise thing in The Immediate Tasks of the Soviet Government. Quote, "Now we have to resort to the old bourgeois method and to agree to pay a very high price for the services of the top bourgeois experts. Clearly, this measure is a compromise, a departure from the principles of the Paris Commune and of every proletarian power, which call for the reduction of all salaries to the levels of the wages of the average worker, which urge that careerism be fought not merely in words, but in deeds." End quote. These wages ended up being 6 times higher than the highest wage of the Soviet government officials. And these conditions did not cease in the USSR. In fact, the USSR urged that this same approach be taken by China when they acted as expert guidance decades later. Like the USSR, the wages for bourgeois experts exploded out of control and recreated a privileged bourgeois class. In a practical sense, this is what led to the excessive party purging campaigns, which never ultimately stopped the incursion of bourgeois values within their projects. This was the furthest progress that these examples ever made. So next, here's Socialism for All admitting the backsliding in Russia and China.
Now, there have been countries which were building socialism, and sometime between then and today have reverted either in an open counter-revolution like the USSR, or in a sharp internal right turn as in China today, where more of those capitalist relations have returned and are spreading, because the class struggle in fact intensifies under socialism and it doesn't always go workers' way.
These are the examples of failure that I'm referring to. Both of these are backsliding into traditional capitalism. Socialism for All says China has vestiges of a socialist system, but there's no worker control of the means of production. What you mean is that China has vestiges of a state capitalist system. Another thing that Socialism for All mentions is that China is maintaining its culture outside of capitalist imperatives.
Even they, with all the revisionism that they're doing, are able to hang on to national sovereignty in a way that you wouldn't see with just open capitalism. An example of that, we started talking about traditional Chinese medicine. Well, China is an enormous grower of medicinal herbs. You wouldn't see that. They'd be growing something like coffee or chocolate, just some kind of cash crop if it was just all about the capitalism. There are elements of other things still existing in China.
This one was really odd to me because China growing natural herbs has nothing to do with escaping the capitalist profit imperative. As you said, they're experiencing a strong pivot to nationalism and traditionalism. Making products which stand in accordance with their traditional culture, which they sell on the market, is not in any way a transcendence of the capitalist imperative. In the US, we have an entire industry of fake supplements and mystics and exploitative churches. These are also not growing corn in mass quantities, yet they still represent capitalist enterprises which produce enormous profits. Capitalism will wiggle into any niche available in order to make profits. They'll grow coffee, chocolate, and natural herbs. Just as in the US, we grow corn, soybeans, and we sell fake supplements in our grocery stores. Is the existence of a fake supplement industry or the proliferation of churches an indication that something other than capitalism is operative in the US? Of course not. Next, he says, these projects should be respected for the progress that they've made.
The point here to me is the anarchist flattening of all these differences is definitely not doing justice to the progress that socialism actually did give. And I know, they still had a government, whatever else, but this is reductionist, like I said before.
Here, we're being asked to respect the progress seen in places like China and the USSR. However, the anarchist is not displeased with higher literacy rates or more efficient industry or more roads. The anarchist is noting that these haven't progressed out of capitalist social relations, and that these same metrics can be seen to have been improved in other capitalist societies. Why are we being asked to praise capitalistic expansion as socialists? Why are we being asked to see these capitalist drives as successes of state attempts at socialism when they are admittedly capitalistic? After all, just a moment ago, it was said that capitalism was being harnessed for its ability to hasten the development of the means of production. Why now are we being asked to praise capitalism? He also mentions that identity issues are often better in ML states.
Another example, indigenous rights under socialism versus under capitalism. There is a huge difference there. Also, sex and gender equality under socialism versus capitalism. Look at women in STEM.
Hey everyone, post-production Daniel and Violet here. So on the question of the treatment of ethnic minorities and indigenous people in the USSR and China, I'm going to hand it over to an up-and-coming black anarchist YouTuber named NLH. He's going to give all the details of the question and give extensive citations. So buckle in, I'll talk with you after NLH is done laying out the case.
Hello everybody, it's NLH. I have a YouTube channel if y'all want to go over there and subscribe to it. Today I'm going to deconstruct the claim that indigenous rights are better under socialism than capitalism. I use socialism lightly because for Marxist-Leninists, socialism typically means state capitalism rather than workers' control over the means of production. For this video, I'm going to analyze the claim that indigenous rights are much better under socialism than capitalism. I'm going to argue 3 points. First, positing for the sake of the argument that indigenous rights were better under Eastern state capitalism than Western neoliberal capitalism, they were still consistently violated, often in egregious ways, and in ways that responded to market forces. For any revolutionary, indigenous rights being slightly better than another system should not be the goal. The threshold for any revolutionary project ought to be indigenous sovereignty. Indigenous rights, while granting certain benefits to the indigenous subject within a settler-colonial project, still perpetuates the settler-indigenous relation and attempts to more peacefully assimilate the indigenous subject into settler-colonial society rather than uprooting settler-colonial society writ large. Hierarchical projects, specifically those started in settler colonial states as the Russian Empire was before the USSR, are not structurally capable of doing this. They perpetuate the settler-indigenous relation under different aesthetics and methods. Second, minority rights in general were often egregiously violated. Third, attempts at redress for indigenous populations and minorities were often poorly implemented, with little effectiveness at best and party posturing towards minority populations at worst. For this section, I will be reviewing a policy in the USSR called Korenizatsiya. One of the most egregious examples of the USSR implementing anti-indigenous policies is its treatment of the Kazakh people during the famine in Kazakhstan. The Kazakh people were nomadic. Party bureaucrats within the USSR saw their practices as culturally backwards and attempted to forcibly sedentarize the indigenous Kazakh people over the course of the first 5-year plan for forced collectivization. While there were multiple causes for the genocide in Kazakhstan from 1930 to 1933, I will argue that extremely negligent and abusive practices towards the Kazakh people, as well as indigenous cultural erasure, were among them. For this section, I will draw on historian Sarah Cameron and her book, The Hungry Steppe Famine, Violence and the Making of Soviet Kazakhstan. In Chapter 4, she specifically reviews variant negligent and abusive practices that the party took against the Kazakh way of life. I'm not going to review all of them, as that would be too long for this specific video essay, but I will review a few key points. The first point I will go over is how, despite multiple warnings that the land in Kazakhstan was not arable and did not meet the requirements necessary for these forced collectivization drives, the party carried out this initiative regardless. There were numerous warnings against these drives from various government officials. Cameron states, under pressure from Moscow to proceed quickly with collectivization, the Republic's Party Committee placed certain districts in the first wave of collectivization, even though members of this committee openly admitted that they knew nothing about the conditions for agriculture in these districts. Only after the completion of the first collectivization drive did Oraz Izaev, the chairman of the Republic's Council of People's Commissars, raise the question of studying the environmental profile of the Republic's constituent districts. On page 104, Cameron states, in Sirdarya province, the orders given to district activists were so staggering, the creation of 4 state farms with 80,000 head of sheep, each in Sari-Suisk district, and 4 state farms with 100,000 head of sheep, each in Talis district, that a later investigation led by the Secretary of the Republic's Central Executive Committee, Abdullah Esobelkov, found that these numbers were constructed without any consideration of whether they could be fulfilled. There's more examples of party bureaucrats ignoring intelligence about the degree to which the land was suited for these collectivization drives. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into every single one of them. If you want to check them out, you're free to check out Chapter 4 of this book. I will link it below. The brutal failures of the collectivization drive in Kazakhstan were not fundamentally questioned. Rather than questioning the merits of top-down hierarchical structures and their ability to respond to the complexity of the region's social ecology, as well as the culture and social life of the Kazakh people, Stalin blamed the subordinate party members under him. Leaders in positions of power within hierarchical systems are structurally positioned and incentivized to deflect accountability and shift blame onto their subordinates. In conjunction with this, hierarchical power structures and bureaucracies are extremely susceptible to rule following. Preventing failures of bureaucracies oftentimes requires questioning the efficiency of bureaucracies themselves. Because bureaucracies, like all hierarchical power structures, reify themselves, they are not structurally capable of doing this, leading to a phenomenon known as rule following. For more information on this, check out my last video, Anarchy and Self-Defense. Cameron expands on Stalin's response on page 110. Rather than critiquing the brutal methods that he chose, Stalin blamed the destruction of collectivization on local cadres who, he claimed, had become quote-unquote dizzy with success in their eagerness to overfill targets and collectivize large swaths of the countryside. Though it was Moscow that had encouraged the rapid collectivization of quote-unquote backward national regions, Stalin now chided local officials for mechanically transplanting collectivization to these areas, writing, quote, in determining the speed and methods of collective farm development, careful consideration must be given to the diversity of conditions in the various regions of the USSR, end quote. Stalin, as an individual at the top of the hierarchical bureaucracy, deferred blame to his subordinates for effectively fulfilling the quotas the party set during his leadership and for following the rules the party set. These adverse effects are a byproduct of hierarchical systems. Still, rather than questioning these adverse effects, the ability to do so is nullified by ideological constraints that hierarchical systems put on themselves. Thus, Stalin resorted to scapegoating. Irrespective of this temper tantrum thrown by Stalin, in 1931, Stalin ramped up grain requisitioning despite the warnings of his advisors. Moreover, many nomadic regions were still being asked to deliver grain. In the fall of 1930, during a heated exchange with Molotov at a Central Committee meeting on grain procurements, Rochelle had cautioned that the pressure for grain on nomadic regions could not be the same as on European regions. Any increase in the Republic's share, he argued, would come at the expense of the sedentarized Kazakh population. Nonetheless, in March 1931, Nikolai Shervnik, an emissary of the Politburo, toured Kazakhstan, concluding that there was considerable amount of grain to be found in the remote regions of the Republic. On July 1st, 1931, Stalin sent Goloshchekin an angry telegram informing him that he would hold him personally responsible for the delivery of 64,000 tons of grain from the Republic's remote regions. Faced with Stalin's wrath, Rochelle quickly began to demand more grain from the regions. In a telegram to the Aksuis district, a majority Kazakh region, he ordered the delivery of 200 tons of grain within 5 days, warning, "The Kraikom will consider the slightest delay in the fulfillment of the plan as your personal deliberate desire not to fulfill the task of the party." End quote. On top of gross negligence on behalf of the party when engaging in grain requisitioning, resulting in more deaths, the party de facto and de jure banned indigenous practices that could have saved lives. This is elucidated by Cameron on pages 109 to 110. Quote, "Far from improving the efficiency of animal husbandry, collectivization was destroying a crucial economic resource, livestock. On February 20th, 1930, in an effort to halt this decline, the Politburo issued a ruling on collectivization and the battle with kulaks in economically backward national districts. The ruling urged local officials to proceed cautiously in livestock regions, carrying out further preparatory work before beginning collectivization, but it offered few concrete policy changes, save those focused on correcting the behavior of nomadic people, an approach that implied that nomads themselves, rather than the party's own directives, were to blame for the herd losses. Cross-border migration and animal slaughter were strategies and responses to the threat of collectivization, but they were also part of the nomads' everyday repertoire of economic practices. Many Kazakhs traversed the Sino-Kazakh border during their seasonal migrations. During the late fall, Kazakhs slaughtered a portion of their herds, preserving this meat for use during the winter, a practice known as sorghum. This practice ensured that Kazakhs would have food during the winter when their animals produced little milk, and it saved them from pasturing additional animals during the lean winter months. But with this ruling, the Central Committee began to blur the distinction between the everyday and the extraordinary, criminalizing a wide range of practices essential to the functioning of nomadic life. Officials were authorized to carry out raids, including the confiscation of livestock and property from nomads trying to emigrate across the border with the goal of driving across livestock, while the secret police, the OGPU, was ordered to strengthen border patrols in nomadic regions. Local authorities were authorized to take decisive measures against the slaughter of livestock in nomadic regions. Officials in Kazakhstan now portrayed sorghum as a criminal act, effectively eliminating the Kazakhs' primary source of food during the wintertime. End quote. Not only was the forcible sedentarization by the party a means by which they aggressively culturally assimilated the indigenous population into a culture that was not theirs, but the techniques utilized by the Kazakh people were far superior to the techniques utilized by party bureaucrats. Outlawing indigenous practices not only caused more deaths, but was a significantly less effective mode of agricultural practice. One could argue that banning nomadism would lead to greater productivity and a more stable form of animal husbandry. I would argue that emphasizing the buildup of productive forces at all costs, while imposing it onto indigenous populations, is anti-indigenous, particularly to nomadic cultures. However, irrespective of this, Cameron demonstrates this is false. It did not lead to a greater increase in productivity. You can find more information in Chapter 4. A good example of this is the Adai clan, the primary clan in the Mangyshlak Peninsula. The USSR described the Adai clan as culturally backwards and having a low productive output, or having low productivity. While the Soviets saw the Adai as emblematic of the instability, quote unquote, and low productivity, quote unquote, of nomadic life, had they adopted techniques from their way of life, they could have prevented famine. Cameron discusses this on pages 112 through 114. The most egregious example of anti-indigenous practices that the Bolsheviks engaged in during their collectivization drives in Kazakhstan was replacing the indigenous Kazakh people with settlers. This is why adhering to a framework of indigenous rights will never adequately solve the settler-indigenous antagonism. In 1931, the Soviets created a labor camp in Kazakhstan known as Karlag, and to increase the productivity of this camp, they forcibly, quote-unquote, resettled, deported, and forcibly sedentarized Kazakhs into other areas of the republic. It is important to note that they did this while importing settlers. Earlier in my introduction, I went over how the USSR engaged in anti-indigenous practices because there were market incentives for it. In Neutrality's Empire, David Nilsson and Hanna Wikström discuss deals that Swedish oil companies made with the USSR. In Chapter 7, they review how specific financial incentives and trade deals encouraged the Soviet Union to build oil pipelines in Siberia despite pushback from its indigenous peoples. Nilsson and Wikström state, the indigenous Khanty population, for its part, was not much happier, refusing to demonstrate any gratitude for the arrival of Soviet civilization. They mourned the destruction of their physical life, worlds, and landscapes. Oil extraction and oil transportation took a heavy toll on the natural environment. The incentive to build an oil pipeline in conjunction with Swedish oil companies was driven by profit, elucidating how the USSR was not able to circumvent the value form within the global marketplace to the extent that they were willing to build up industry at the expense of their own indigenous populations to get a return on investment. Destruction of the environment, forcibly assimilating natives, and engaging in practices antithetical to native culture are all results of anti-indigenous practices. It is genuinely perplexing when Marxist-Leninists go on polemic rants about the West by correctly identifying anti-indigenous practices as a means by which industry can be built on stolen land for capital accumulation, but ignore when their state capitalist projects do the same in the name of building up quote-unquote productive forces. Why not remain consistent? Earlier, I discussed how the Soviet Union implemented a program called Korenizatsiya. This program was essentially the Soviet version of affirmative action and is typically used as an example by authoritarian leftists favorable to the USSR that their projects heavily invested in the rights of indigenous and minority populations. Without going into extreme detail, I will elucidate 2 points. First, hierarchical power structures are structurally incapable of addressing ethnic, gender, or racial tensions, as these programs had numerous shortcomings. Second, these programs within a hierarchical society typically always result in ethnic backlash by the dominant group. To analyze Korenizatsiya, I will draw on historian Terry Martin's book, The Affirmative Action Empire. Before diving into the details of Korenizatsiya, one must analyze how centralized power structures operate. Any centralized power structure has limited access to that power structure by virtue of its own centralization. Not everyone can be in a position of power. Those who gain access to a centralized power structure are typically already in positions of cultural, economic, and social dominance within their respective societies. Those within the dominant group in their society have greater access to social, cultural, and financial capital. They have a unique propensity to rise to power within a centralized power structure, to mold and shape that structure, and to impose norms that disadvantage subordinate groups. The hierarchical power structure acts as a conduit through which power is exerted and imposed on subordinate groups. Implicit biases of social agents are reflected within the hierarchical power structures in which they operate. This is why, paradoxically, any hierarchical power structure that is used to ameliorate ethnic, racial, or gender power differentials will inadvertently reify them. Those in positions of power within a hierarchical structure are usually members of the dominant group in society or minorities who assimilate into the dominant group's norms. Efforts to mitigate ethnic, racial, or gender power differentials are undertaken in ways that do not threaten the dominant group's hegemonic control, maintaining social stratification. Often, benefits given to the subordinate group are granted only when they benefit the dominant group. This is known as interest convergence. The implicit and explicit biases of those within the dominant group prevent genuine redress for racial, ethnic, or gender discrimination. When the power structure is centralized, the dominant group can enforce its norms, which reinforce its dominance over others, including those in subordinate groups. Interest convergence, created by sociologist Derek Bell, is an apt framework for describing Korenizatsiya. Korenizatsiya was implemented at a time when the USSR was trying to secure the borders of a new, fragile state and integrate a distrustful, multi-ethnic population into the Soviet Union. A lack of ethnic dissonance within the USSR would benefit the Russian dominant group in society, as ethnic cohesion would allow an interrupted rise in nation-state building and Soviet industry. However, Korenizatsiya was never implemented in a way that ever threatened Russian hegemony in the USSR and Russians as a dominant group. Martin illustrates multiple examples of this. One way Korenizatsiya was used was to integrate minority populations into jobs, similar to affirmative action programs in the US. Martin explains that Korenizatsiya rates across every non-Russian republic would still result in social stratification, despite increases in employment among minority populations. This was due to the technical leadership split phenomena. Ethnic minorities would often land jobs through Korenizatsiya programs. However, they were placed in lower status leadership roles rather than higher status technical roles, specifically engineering. Martin calls this phenomenon the hole in the middle. Martin also describes a similar technical, cultural, educational split, wherein Eastern titular nationals were more likely to gain employment in pedagogical occupations rather than higher status technical professions, while controlling for education levels. As discussed earlier, the foundational structure of centralized power results in the forced assimilation of the subordinate group, who must adopt the norms of the dominant group by virtue of the dominant group having the social, economic, and cultural capital necessary to gain access to finite seats of power within the hierarchical power structure. This is illustrated extremely clearly in an example Martin gives during a program known as Promotion. Promotion was a campaign to train and promote workers to replace the old intelligentsia who were purged from the workforce. The non-Russian workers were treated with extreme hostility, often systemically mocked, denied apartments, or given disgusting living and working conditions. The workers were also given instructions and materials exclusively in Russian, thereby contributing to high turnover rates due to a lack of fluency in Russian. Similar problems were found during Korenizatsiya programs implemented in education. These programs were called brania, a combination of secondary institutions turning away unqualified students, eliminating their stipends and dormitory rights, and technical training being in Russia, as well as the responsibility for brania being transferred from the Education Commissariat to the Committee on Higher Technical Education, which, as a representative of the all-union economic commissariats, was indifferent to national minority education, all led to high dropout rates amongst ethnic minorities. Forced assimilation can also be elucidated in the Central Asian republics. Uzbekistan implemented a program to try to promote the use of Uzbek language by requiring that all paperwork and state institutions be written in Uzbek. Uzbekistan also required Europeans to learn Uzbek, threatening dismissal if they failed to do so. However, because Uzbeks remained a minority within their own government, this initiative never came to fruition. Despite attempts to issue directives in Uzbek, correspondence with non-Uzbek institutions was also rarely written in Uzbek, and when it was either answered or returned with a request for Russian translation. Russian chauvinism often acted as a threshold by which these affirmative action programs had to adhere without threatening ethnic dissonance. Martin identified two themes that dominated in Russian complaints against Korenizatsiya. First, that Russians had made enormous sacrifices on behalf of the revolution and had been unjustly denied their deserved rewards. And second, that Korenizatsiya made them outsiders, guests in what they had considered to be their homeland. Russians particularly resented the fact that Korenizatsiya implied that Uzbekistan belonged to the Uzbeks, that, quote, we conquered Turkestan and now the Uzbeks are the masters, end quote. Central authorities were extremely displeased and put off by Russian resentment. Martin states, quote, although a certain degree of Russian resentment was accepted as necessary, this was the outcome that in general most displeased central authorities. Thus, while the center did not contest absolute preferences for nationals in hiring, it consistently rejected firing Russians to replace them with titular nationals. The Org Bureau categorically denounced a Buryat law authorizing this practice. The Andreev Commission likewise censored this practice, labeling it mechanical Korenizatsiya. Programs that encourage quotas within hiring practices, education, etc., were labeled as mechanical Korenizatsiya. Due to Russian resentment, central authorities changed Korenizatsiya programs from strict quotas to ones that gave preference to personnel who learned the languages of ethnic minorities and the titular nation, a shift called functional Korenizatsiya, end quote. As stated previously, interest convergence allows subordinate groups to get partial access to societal benefits insofar as they do not threaten the hegemony of the dominant group. The examples listed previously elucidate how, during these programs, even when subordinate groups received benefits, there was still immense institutional pressure to assimilate into Russian culture, high turnover rates due to a lack of Russian fluency, placement in jobs that were lower in status compared to the dominant group, and strides in education that were offset by a lack of Russian fluency, causing high dropout rates. Strides in education, employment, and literacy in native language were all limited to the extent that they did not diminish Russian hegemony and cultural norms. Hierarchical systems have a limit on the amount of ethnic, racial, and gendered harm that they can redress. These systems reify the norms and institutional control of the dominant group within society, only giving the subordinate group access to social, economic, and cultural capital insofar as it does not threaten the dominant group, which has control over the central node within the power structure. To utilize hierarchical systems for racial, gendered, or ethnic redress is akin to utilizing social welfare reforms to address the negative effects of capitalist social relations. Reforms are simply given to quell worker resentment towards structural capitalism, allowing capitalism to exist while maintaining the exploitative nature of the bourgeoisie exploiting the proletariat. Capital owners have a vested interest in capital accumulation, similar to how the dominant group in society, whose existence within their dominant status derives from hierarchical structures, has a vested interest in accumulating social, financial, and cultural capital over the rest of society. It's not surprising that after Korenizatsiya was implemented, intense Russification campaigns followed. This, as well as campaigns against minority populations, including indigenous populations, such as the brutal deportation of the Crimean Tatars. Terry Martin has an excellent article on the deportation of ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union, utilizing the Soviet archives. While the USSR might have made strides that outpaced the West, its hierarchical structure resulted in outcomes similar to the West, while falling victim to the same perverse incentives that all hierarchical power structures do. It is not enough to be better than the West when it comes to the rights of indigenous people or ethnic minorities. It grants small strides within a system predicated on domination, rather than ushering in the complete liberation of these groups. It is our job as revolutionaries to use means that bring us closest to these ends, and hierarchical structures have proven inefficient at this task. Anyway, back to Daniel.
Next, he makes the claim that anarchists define worker ownership as being worker and producer cooperatives.
Finally, on the subject of worker ownership, anarchists tend to define worker ownership of industry more exclusively to be producer and worker cooperatives, and particularly with lots of enterprise autonomy.
No, they don't. These are merely explicit examples of worker ownership. However, these don't exhaust the range of worker ownership. Anarchists seek for workers themselves to control the entirety of the combined economy that they're part of. This takes place at various scales of federation, using forms of democratic decision-making and negotiation between regions of all sizes. The anarchist movement originated in what was sometimes called the Federalist movement for this reason. This fact was attested to in the quote about the C&T-FAI before, but it's also explained by Sam Dolgoff in the conclusion to The Anarchist Collectives, when describing the anarchist conception of self-management. Quote, "By definition, self-management is the idea that workers, all workers, including technicians, engineers, scientists, planners, coordinators, all, engaged in providing goods and services, can themselves efficiently administer and coordinate the economic life of society. This belief must of necessity be based upon three inseparable principles. 1. Faith in the constructive and creative capacity, not of an elite class of superior individuals, but of the masses, the much maligned average man. 2. Autonomy, self-rule. And 3. Decentralization and coordination through the free agreement of federalism. By definition, self-management means that workers are equal partners in a vast network of interlocking cooperative associations embracing the whole range of production and distribution of goods and the rendering of services. It must of necessity be based upon the fundamental principle of free communism, that is, the equal access to and sharing of goods and services according to needs." End quote. Anarchists do not advocate for workers' cooperatives to become the whole of the economy. This would maintain wage relations, commodity production, and alienation of the workers from one another. However, cooperatives do give direct power to the workers, by contrast to representative democracy, which merely allows workers to vote on their rulers from time to time. Here, we come across what Leon Trotsky, well before he became a Bolshevik, called substitutionism. Quote, "The organization of the party substitutes itself for the party as a whole. Then the Central Committee substitutes itself for the organization. And finally, the dictator substitutes himself for the Central Committee." End quote. In state-controlled economies, the workers are then not given power over their lives. They do not own the means of production, and there's no aspect in which they are moving toward this fact. Instead, people who are not them are given the ability to make decisions which affect them, and which they have no recourse for other than to elect another bureaucrat. The contention of the anarchists is not that each workplace must be a single self-contained entity controlling only itself and only controlled by itself. It is instead that the workers' cooperative is a meaningful step forward in direct empowerment of the workers, whereas the state is an intermediary body which controls the means of production instead of the workers, sets their wages, their hours, the conditions of their work, and may hire or fire them as it pleases, moving them to another industry if it pleases, and imprisoning them in camps if it pleases. The workers' cooperative is not an ideal, it's simply a transitional body which gives the workers control within the conditions of capitalism. Whereas the supposed workers' state only ever amounts to a bureaucratic body contending that it is the true representative of the workers, while really being the source of their continued alienation from cooperative control over the means of production. The idea that anarchists just want petty production and enterprise autonomy has no foundation in anarchist theory after Proudhon. The Marxists have been stuck in the past, rereading the same empty critiques for over a century now. They'd do better to begin catching up with Bakunin at the end of the 19th century, and then perhaps develop a modern understanding within the last century of what anarchists actually advocate. I recommend reading Farge's Social Anarchism and Organization, or Anarchism and the Black Revolution by Lorenzo Camboa Irvin, or my book, A Modern Anarchism. Speaking of, the series of video essays that I wrote called A Modern Anarchism is now being compiled into a book which is going to be released October 27th. So if you'd like to support the work that I'm doing, if you'd like to learn more about anarchism, then I highly recommend you go over and pre-order a copy of A Modern Anarchism. Or I guess if you're watching this after October 27th, just go buy a copy of A Modern Anarchism. I think that if you have a strong understanding of theory, or even kind of an intermediate understanding of theory when you're coming into this, the book is going to be understandable. It might be a little bit challenging, but I think you'll get a lot out of it, and afterwards you'll understand anarchism a whole lot better. All right, day 2. So, as we move on to the spreadsheet critiques that are the actual focus of the original stream clip, or at least what everybody who responded made the focus of the original stream clip, I just want to note that that video wasn't meant to be like some deeply academic work. The spreadsheet calculations were just a back-of-the-envelope series of calculations. I was just kind of trying to look for what the basic trends were. So I went to the Wikipedia page and I put it all into a spreadsheet and I got the numbers. And that's really all it amounted to at that point. However, I just want to say that it still doesn't really matter how rigorous those calculations were, because they still point to a common fact. And that is that Marxism-Leninism isn't really the deeply practical methodology that it pretends to be. So, Socialism for All asked me, what is your metric of failure?
But what are we talking about when we're talking about failure? These things existed, they got off the ground, they had a history, they changed society, people participated in them, they benefited from them and learned from them, we're still learning from them today. Those legacies live on in so many ways today.
And in my broader work, the most primary metric that I'm concerned with is the development of the worker control of the means of production. And as noted above, I don't mean intermediary control or the right to oversight. I mean direct control over the means of production at scale. And on this measure, I was very overly generous in my calculations because there have been 0 examples of this in all of the entries in that list. In other words, the Marxist-Leninist methodology has a 100% failure rate by the most important metric. However, here I was being charitable. I was merely speaking about how states perpetuate themselves. After all, this is the primary argument of the Marxist-Leninists, that they're the only ones who can produce a state that continues on under siege from other capitalist nations. However, by merely quantifying the number of these states, which no longer exist, we can see that that's simply not true. These states have survived despite the fact that they're ruled by the iron fist of the party, not because of it. Because, after all, we've seen plenty of capitalist states survive without those exact features, so they're clearly not needed. But let's move on for now. I'll get back to these spreadsheet critiques later in the video when I address Bad Empanada. So next, Socialism for All notes that we're talking about 1/3 of the world being changed and impacted by Marxism-Leninism.
We're talking about 1/3 of the world impacted, changed by this ideology, which is just being reduced here to a, quote, failed ideology. First of all, history's not over yet, and we do see this making a comeback. That's the entire premise of the video, in fact, is why is anarchism lagging behind the growth of Marxism-Leninism?
So yes, that's true, but the burden is upon you to prove that this is fundamentally different from the development that's taking place under other bourgeois democracies. Simply claiming that your ideology is popular and that it's had an impact is no measure of whether it has been successful in changing the world toward revolutionary goals. Fascism has also proliferated across the planet, and it has also made an impact and failed many times. Are we to say that fascism is therefore successful in the development of revolutionary goals, and that we should respect and learn from its revolutionaries? Surely not. And I wouldn't expect you to say so. I'll caveat here that I'm not saying that your examples are like fascism, though a few might stand out as such. I'm instead pointing out that this argument doesn't have a structurally valid logical form. Something is successful by our metric if it makes progress toward our goal. However, as I've said, these examples on the list have also failed by the way of the simple metric of survival. The only metric by which they can be said to have been successes are the same metrics by which capitalism can be said to be a success. And upon what metrics can capitalism be said to be a success? Well, number 1, that it has survived, and number 2, that it has improved conditions over feudalism. However, we can't consider it a good thing that capitalism has succeeded by the first metric unless we are ourselves capitalists, and upon the second metric, we could problematize the assumption by pointing to the many ways capitalism has also harmed people, but ultimately we must regard that the conditions being improved doesn't mean we're making progress toward socialism. Capitalism is in many ways an improvement over feudalism. Also, if capitalism is said to be successful by way of its survival, then, as we've pointed out, the failure rate for Marxist-Leninist attempts has been abysmally low. And if we accept only that it has improved conditions, then really, we must have no qualms with capitalism or social democracy writ large. Why fight an armed revolution for something that parliamentarianism has achieved elsewhere? The goal of socialist revolution is not simple improvement of conditions. That is the vulgar socialism that Marx referred to in our quote towards the beginning. Improvements in conditions will result as our method succeeds in its goals of worker emancipation and control over the means of production. But if all we seek is the simple improvement of conditions, then we're better off as social democrats, as this has the greatest proven track record of happiness and contentment of all systems currently on Earth. Our job is to see beyond the simple placating factors of society as it stands, and to demand complete alterations of the power structures of society, not to beg for more table scraps from the tables of the rulers. Next, Socialism for All notes that revolution means that there has to be transformation of conditions from the bottom up.
And really, this experience is part of why I gravitated toward Marxism-Leninism, because I realized for anything like this to work, it is not going to be an easy transition. You need a revolutionary reshaping of society from the ground up for people to be ready for this and to get out of the kind of dog-eat-dog, hyper-competitive world that just is not supportive of the kind of mindset you need to be in a cooperative enterprise.
So, despite popular critiques of anarchists, we actually agree that there has to be a transitional stage between capitalism and socialism. The difference is that anarchists believe that this transformation takes place from within the people, and that new bodies must be created which embody this change to act as vessels for that transformation, and that these bodies must then grow in strength and perpetuate themselves across society. By contrast, state socialist ideologies contend that this change can only happen by the creation of a workers' state, which then imposes this change upon the masses of people. However, this is a defiance of the laws of system science, which dictates that top-down control mechanisms are fragile and self-destructive, because they fail to attenuate complexity. The former perspective, that we must build vessels which embody our values within society as it exists, anarchists call prefiguration. The IWW slogan is that we are building the new in the shell of the old. This is why workers' cooperatives get brought up so much. They're not meant to be autonomous enterprises operating all alone in a capitalist market. These are meant to be atoms of a new structure, which are then combined together with union struggles, communes, logistics networks, media cooperatives, and all other varieties of prefigurative bodies. These are the bodies that carry out transformation within the anarchist perspective. If you'd like to learn more about prefiguration, you should watch or read my work, Constructing the Revolution. If you'd like even more detail, you should watch or read parts 2, 3, and 4 of my work, A Modern Anarchism. Workers' cooperatives are also not meant to completely permeate the economy. They're not likely to become the majority of the enterprises while capitalism continues to exist, for reasons that Socialism for All states in this section of the video. They're bodies which produce income, which can then be funneled into the expansion of prefigurative structures of the revolution. The cooperatives make money, and the money goes to the revolution. What's needed is for these cooperatives to be organized together and to be given common cause so that they can have a revolutionary orientation. However, by themselves, they're not enough, and hardly any anarchist will tell you that they are. Next, Socialism for All points out that the Zapatistas aren't even anarchist.
I just want to make a brief point about the Zapatistas because they're often claimed by anarchists as more of an anarchist-type movement. However, the Zapatistas themselves do not claim that. Their roots, in fact, are in Marxism-Leninism. However, along the course of their development in the 80s and the 90s, they strayed from some of the major Marxist-Leninist goals, such as the seizure of state power, or major Marxist concepts like the centering of the industrial proletariat, and more of a focus instead on indigenous communities. So you get a lot more of indigenous practices in terms of the way that they regard land use and govern themselves. So the Zapatistas' analysis tends to sound a lot like Marxism. Their practice is something that anarchists often look at and are happy with, or, are interested in claiming. However, there is also something which is really neither of these directly, but more of an indigenous political movement.
I will never understand why this point is so popular among authoritarian leftists. Anarchists aren't claiming that the Zapatistas are anarchists. They're claiming that the Zapatistas are carrying out methods that are in accordance with anarchist methods. Anarchists don't need a revolutionary project to wave black flags or emblazon a Circle A on their buildings. We want the revolution of the people, and we will support that revolution, whether it calls itself the Zapatistas or the Free Territories of Ukraine or whatever else. Next, Socialism for All claims that the Zapatistas have dissolved.
Also, it bears mentioning that in recent years, 2023, they were dissolving autonomous governing structures due to the cartel violence. That is a significant loss to the progressive movements in the Western Hemisphere and a reflection on what dark times we're living in, with world imperialism just turning into world fascism. Point being, their organizational structure was not immune to that either.
So this is blatant misinformation. The Zapatistas have absolutely not dissolved. They have decentralized. There are now many, many more governing structures than beforehand. And this method was purposeful, as to create many more sites of power and therefore allow them to weather the violence by reactionaries. Next, Socialism for All says that anarchists never take power.
I mentioned that I had had kind of an ANCOM phase before studying Marxism-Leninism. My ANCOM phase came to an end with one specific event. I got this thought and I wrote it down on a piece of scrap paper. How do anarchists take power? Then I looked into it and I saw it really didn't happen very often. That was one of the key data points that moved me away from anarchism. Because I'm interested in world peace, world development, all of that means overcoming capitalism, and it means fighting capitalism effectively. To me, my sincere evaluation of the historical evidence from the last 150 years is that Marxism just does this better than anarchism. That's why I do what I do now. I went looking for that evidence, I didn't see it, and I moved on.
So Socialism for All claims that he asked himself the question, how do anarchists take power, and came to the conclusion that they don't. And this is a pretty serious oversight, given that there are numerous examples to learn from, the CNT-FAI and the Free Territories of Ukraine, just to name a few. It seems that Socialism for All came to his position by very poor research into anarchism. He asked the question, did I move on prematurely? And I think this admission, as well as his previous admission that he wasn't familiar with means-ends unity, gives a pretty clear answer, and that's yes, he did. He didn't do the basic research into anarchist theory or read any history of the anarchist movement, as far as I can see. So next, Socialism for All claims that you have to conquer the national territory because the state apparatus rests at the level of the nation, and if you don't conquer it, you can't do a revolution. You're still just engaged in civil war.
I believe what the question was getting at was not population, but the question of decisively controlling a territory, i.e. more than a few provinces, but completely uprooting the capitalist state, which is organized on national lines. So, if you are uprooting capitalism, you would be uprooting the state of an entire country and then building socialism there. Until you've done that, you're basically still engaged in a revolutionary civil war.
I think it's a good idea for us to think about how the capitalists conquered the world. Not that we're trying to model our revolution on the capitalists, but it's instructive to look at the only revolution that has actually succeeded in the past. So when you look at it, the capitalists didn't, in the 1500s, go about staging a revolutionary coup of just a few business owners scattered throughout the Low Country of Italy and Spain. Instead, they built an entire alternative mode of living in those places, an entire new economic approach, an entire substrate of laborers, and a means of production which accorded to it. This then expanded in the form of a new culture, new philosophy, and new political outlooks. It took hundreds of years of this sort of development before this new revolutionary constituency was actually able to then vest control decisively over a national boundary and to overthrow the state that dominated it. The French Revolution didn't come out of nowhere, and its solidification was not the result of Napoleon Bonaparte. The French Revolution was the result of the slow prefiguration of capitalism starting in the 1500s, which then reached its fever point much later as it had gained enough power to challenge the prevailing systems. This perspective is like claiming that in the 1500s, the bourgeois should have just overthrown their states. Worse, if we're to parallel the Marxist-Leninist conception of change, then you would argue that they actually just should have put feudalism in place so that they could one day transition to capitalism. This lacks an understanding of how power structures work and how they are in feedback with society as it exists. As was said earlier, there has to be a complete transformation of social outlooks and expectations before a revolution can truly take hold. You said that it's necessary to conquer a national boundary to make a sort of camp in the geopolitical struggle, but this contradicts the reality of how the only revolutionary transformation up till now, the bourgeois revolution, carried out its transformation. If all one does is make a camp out of the capitalist nation that it has recently conquered, with people who are still indoctrinated in capitalism's ideology, with infrastructure built for capitalist ends, then it will merely pilot a capitalist country in an inter-imperialist war between capitalists. So that's my response to Socialism for All, and I just want to say I appreciate that Socialism for All actually really watched the video and considered what I was saying and answered it in a way that had theoretical backing and made sense as per his perspective. He argued his point very articulately, and even though I disagree with him, I appreciate the rigor of his arguments. So now we're moving on to Bad Empanada. Let's talk about Bad Empanada. So Bad Empanada made, I would say, a very snarky response to my video, which was insulting, demeaning, and full of misinformation and kind of babbling nonsense at various points.
An American hipster anarchist has made a video telling us about how Marxism-Leninism doesn't work.
However, I'm going to take the high road, and we're just going to address all of Bad Empanada's arguments here, and I hope anybody watching this who's just skipping straight to this part because you're a fan of Bad Empanada or you just want to know about the juicy drama, please go watch the rest of the video, because a lot of the arguments that are going to be taking place here are arguments that are backed up by quotes and examples and data that was presented in the first half of this video. I've developed my argument up till now by addressing Socialism for All's theoretical arguments. I will be developing them now further in my discussion with Bad Empanada. So if you don't watch the first half of the video, then don't comment on my responses to Bad Empanada in a snarky way in the comments. Go watch the first half of the video. That being said, let's get on to Bad Empanada. So like with Socialism for All, I started by summarizing Socialism for All as per his description. Let's summarize Bad Empanada. First of all, Bad Empanada claims that he's not particularly attached to Marxism-Leninism, and I will say, as a former watcher of his channel, I would characterize him as a third worldist and a Peronist. And he seems to take on political perspectives very opportunistically rather than out of any principle.
What Americans give a single fucking shit about is their own personal well-being. This much we know. So, what is there aside from strategic zogging? What is there aside from letting them believe in the ridiculous fantasies that they too are victims of Israel? That's what we tell them. Strategic zog. And you're going to be like, oh, but it's wrong. I don't give a fuck. Who gives a shit if it's wrong? They didn't care when we were telling them the right thing, did they?
Lastly, I would note that Bad Empanada is absolutely addicted to drama. But let's get started with his actual responses.
I'm not particularly attached to Marxism-Leninism, but you can't really deny that the USSR and the states inspired by it have been the most successful instances of anything at all counter-hegemonic to generic liberal-style capitalism and the generic Western-dominated world order since it cropped up. By far, nothing else even comes close. Anarchism has, by the way, never once even remotely come close to creating a new or different society.
So, as already addressed in the rest of this video, this just isn't true. Though it is true that the USSR formed a counterposed geopolitical bloc to the United States and its coalition, the USSR was, sadly, a force for counter-revolution, which re-established capitalism in Russia after the workers fought a revolution to put socialism in place. If anyone would like to learn more about that, I recommend watching my series, The State is Counter-Revolutionary. So, as I've discussed earlier in the video as well, the Spanish anarchists during the Spanish Civil War achieved far, far more progress towards socialism in a much, much shorter period of time than the USSR by every conceivable metric.
So I'm interested in what he has to say here. I can't wait to see. Maybe I'll learn something.
You know, this is funny because I don't think Bad Empanada is capable of actually learning anything from somebody he disagrees with. He thinks he already knows everything about every subject he speaks about, and as we'll see, he doesn't. In fact, he mostly just kind of repeats the same talking points as Socialism for All, but with a lot less rigor.
I mean, that's just totally untrue. There were literally, like, actually borderline revolutions all across the First World until social democracy was implemented there.
Correct. Like state capitalism, social democracy is a holding maneuver by capitalism to prevent the proletariat from being empowered.
And when we're talking about social democracy, we're not talking about Soviet-style politics. The Soviet system is obviously way different.
It's not. As has been demonstrated, state capitalism differs from social democracy, but not by a substantial amount. They're both forms of political management of capitalist economic and social relations.
Social democracy is just a welfare state. The Soviet system was so far beyond that, so fucking far beyond that. They're barely comparable. Like, there are elements of them that are comparable. Sure, like the state would give you assistance if you were disabled or unemployed or whatever.
That's correct. They both use welfare programs in place of socialization of the means of production. And that's not a coincidence. This is due to the fact that they're both forms of what Marx called vulgar socialism, or what Engels called spurious socialism, which viewed distribution as the principal feature of socialism, rather than the reorganization of social management into the hands of the workers.
But then there's also everything else to the system, like the elements of who owns what, how is production directed, for what purpose.
The only one of the things that were listed there that's actually relevant as to whether these projects are socialist is whether the proletariat owns the means of production. And they didn't. Let's repeat Marx's words. The capitalist mode of production rests on the fact that the material conditions of production are in the hands of non-workers, in the form of property and capital and land, while the masses are only owners of the personal condition of production, of labor power. This exact description was maintained in all of those examples, and so the only relevant feature you mentioned, which was ownership of the means of production, is not oriented in such a way as to produce socialist ownership relations. None of the other features you listed are relevant as to whether they're socialist. And as was said at the beginning of the video, it's not really relevant if there are differences otherwise. I didn't state they were identical. No two systems are identical, and they don't need to be identical in order to be in the same category. I'll leave you to engage in stamp collecting.
Because it turns out that there's actually quite a bit of a difference between just a social democracy, which is like a capitalist economy, right, dominated by a bourgeoisie who dictate production. They produce purely for the purpose of generating profit, versus an economy that is more state-directed, like that of the Soviet Union, for example, where the state can choose what economic production is directed towards, for what purpose, how and why.
So this part is really interesting because, as we've already established in the video, commodity production persisted in the USSR indefinitely. Stalin even wrote a polemic defending commodity production in the USSR. The bourgeois persisted in the USSR as well, not only in that private ownership of enterprise continued, but also functioning as experts and delegates in state-owned enterprises. This national bourgeois then mixed together with the Soviet leadership. In the book The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control, Maurice Britton recounts an event in which the Bolshevik politician Vyacheslav Molotov underwent an analysis of the composition of the delegates within the Soviets after the Civil War. Of 400 persons concerned, over 10% were former employers or employers' representatives, 9% technicians, 38% officials from various departments, including the central state, and the remaining 43% workers or representatives of workers' organizations, including trade unions. The management of production was predominantly in the hands of persons having no relation to the proletarian elements in industry. The delegate bodies had to be regarded as organs in no way corresponding to the proletarian dictatorship. Those who directed policy were employers' representatives, technicians, and specialists. It was indisputable that the Soviet bureaucrat of those early years was, as a rule, a former member of the bourgeois intelligentsia or official class, and brought with him many of the traditions of the old Russian bureaucracy. The state directing economic production is also something that occurs in social democracies. In fact, Norway has extensive nationalization, including state ownership of oil companies, and it remains the largest employer nationally. This allows the Norwegian government to direct extensive parts of the economy. The main difference is just that the Bolsheviks did so through dictatorial command, whereas a country like Norway does it through parliament. This comports precisely with my claim that Marxism-Leninism is just insurrectionary social democracy. It achieves through the barrel of a gun what others have achieved through elections. So like when you're in a capitalist nation, social democracy appears as a rational improvement upon your circumstances. And so you kind of got two options about how you're going to get it. You're either going to get it through insurrection and building a vanguard that's going to try to overturn everything, or you're going to get it through electoralism. You do parliamentary tactics, right? So it's natural when people haven't been fully radicalized that they don't have
like, is there a single revolution that he's talking about that just resulted in the institution of social democracy? I'm trying to think of like a Marxist revolution that resulted not in like a totalizing so-called Marxist-Leninist state with like a monopoly over production and everything being instituted, but rather just social democracy. And I'm coming up blank. All of the examples that I'm thinking of were that, like, at least initially, like Vietnam, the USSR, Cuba, Yugoslavia even, Laos, China. I can't think of a single example that is as he's describing it. That is a revolution that led to a social democracy afterwards. That was like a Marxist revolution. The only ones that even remotely approximate what he says are like things like mass protest strikes and such, which scared the capitalists in certain countries into instituting social democratic reforms, like the Bismarck reforms, for example.
So this point appears to have gone completely over Bad Empanada's head. Every single state that you named is an example. And I've demonstrated why extensively in the previous part of this video, but it's interesting that you pointed out the Bismarck reforms. Bismarckian reformism is precisely the sort of vulgar socialism Marx was originally referring to. Engels also criticized quote-unquote socialists of the time who tried to make Bismarck's reform out as being socialist using the same logic as you're using. Quote, of late, since Bismarck went in for state ownership of industrial establishments, a kind of spurious socialism has arisen that declares all state ownership, even of the Bismarckian sort, to be socialistic. Certainly, if the taking over by the state of the tobacco industry is socialistic, then Napoleon and Metternich must be numbered among the founders of socialism. If the Belgian state, for quite ordinary political and financial reasons, itself constructed its chief railway lines, this was in no sense a socialistic measure, directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously. Otherwise, the Royal Maritime Company, the Royal Porcelain Manufacturer, and even the Regimental Tailor of the Army would also be socialistic institutions. The position that Engels is criticizing here is precisely your position and the position of most quote-unquote vulgar socialists of today, who mostly focus on distribution rather than proletarian power as the chief determining factor of the societal order.
The USSR, whatever you think about whether it was capitalist or not, it had, by a certain point, totally eliminated the bourgeoisie as a class. They were gone. They simply did not exist anymore functionally.
There is no point in the history of the USSR where the bourgeois were actually eliminated. Not only did private ownership persist for the entire history of the USSR, but most of the bourgeois just became state technicians, planning capitalist production from within the state. In this sense, all that really changed is that many of those bourgeois went from being at the head of a firm under private property distinctions to the technicians of a capitalist firm called the state. This is more akin to Amazon taking over the entire grocery market, employing technicians from other grocery chains, than it is to socialism.
To ask anyone who has lived in the USSR, who experienced class relations there, who experienced their relationship to the means of production, their relationship to the state, ask them if it really is just so similar to capitalism. It really fucking isn't.
Yeah, and just ask anybody in Sudan if it's like living in the United States. Does that mean Sudan isn't capitalist? This is an extremely, extremely weak argument.
Cuba basically achieved most of these, at least to some heavy degree. Decommodification. The Cuban economy was pretty much completely decommodified, as in things were not being produced for the purpose of rendering a profit. Like, things were being produced for their use value. They were not being produced in order to make more money.
This is just either a blatant lie or ignorance. We've already explained why nationalization is not a decommodification, so I won't belabor the point again. Cuba has never transcended the commodity form. It's engaged in nationalization campaigns and market controls.
But either way, let's ignore all of that for a second and say that what he's saying here was true. Would this mean that anarchism is still a better alternative? Because anarchism has never done anything even remotely approximating that.
While commodity production persisted in places like the USSR, Cuba, China, Vietnam, and all your other examples, this is what reported conditions were in one of the cities in Aragon province in Spain during the time that anarchists had collectivized the region. Money is abolished and has been replaced by vouchers. Food, meat, and all other provisions are distributed in quantity when plentiful or equitably rationed when in short supply. The collective allows 5 liters of wine per person weekly. Medical care and medicines are free. Even postage stamps are free. There's no rent. Housing, building repairs, water, gas, electricity, all are supplied gratis, not only to the collectivists, but also to the individualists. The village generates its own power from a waterfall. There's no scarcity of clothing. By arrangement with a Barcelona textile plant, oil is exchanged for cloth, dresses, etc. Garments are distributed in rotation to 40 persons daily. Though this was not by any means universal, conditions such as these took place in numerous regions of anarchist-liberated Spain, which in total encompassed up to 8 million people. Nothing even approaching this level of communist advancement took place in any of the examples that you just gave. It cannot be expressed the degree to which the Spanish revolutionaries sprinted ahead of all state examples in the implementation of socialism and communism. The state has only ever created capitalism, whereas the anarchists, when they have reached their furthest extent, have put in place socialism as a default and communism in measure. Here, this one's funny because he says that I've never heard anybody say that, and then he goes on to literally say it immediately afterwards.
The Marxist-Leninists have done an excellent job of presenting themselves as the pragmatists in the room. They're the pure utilitarians. Like, you need to just accept that our vanguard rule is good and is going to bring about good things, and then, you'll get out of your naive, childish beliefs.
I mean, is that what they say? I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that. Though anarchists are childish. Anarchists are absolutely childish. Like, anarchists can't tell you anything about, like, what should be done, how it should be done, how their society could ever possibly come into being, how they themselves are possibly working towards this. They can't tell you any of these things. They don't have answers to these questions.
Wow, that was just a really good point. I've actually written numerous pieces on the subject. I recommend Constructing the Revolution, as well as A Modern Anarchism. However, if you want a historic view, I recommend reading about the lead up to the CNTFAI in Spain. The piece I've been citing in this video, The Anarchist Collectives, is an excellent starting point. You should also look at the lead up to the Russian Revolution, as it had many anarchic elements before the Bolshevik takeover. For that, I recommend reading the beginning of The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control. For modern praxis in continuity with the CNTFAI, I recommend reading Social Anarchism and Organization by Farge. So after this, Baden Parada just kind of rambles and repeats a bunch of points I've already addressed in the video, but the next thing he says that's actually worth addressing is regarding the spreadsheet, though he gets off to a bit of a rough start.
All of their self-claimed quote-unquote socialist projects and all their quote-unquote self-claimed communist projects. And I researched them, and I literally went and I counted it up. And did the statistics. They have failed 196 of 200 times.
What does that even mean? What does failure mean in this case? Like the state collapsing or something?
It's funny because he starts by being like, what does this even mean? And then he goes on to demonstrate immediately after that he knows exactly what it means. He's only reacting in this sort of big, angry way because I pinned him down precisely. This is the authoritarian left myth, that they are the practical ones. They want to feel powerful because they feel weak. It is a cult of impotence. And I think this is important because this is the real reason that they hated this video. They dislike the talking point of my video because it demonstrates that their power is a myth. They claim they're the only way to resist imperialism, but then they get crushed by imperialism, just like every other project. They resort to capitalism to survive, and therefore, they just become capitalist. Then they lose to imperialism anyway. He knows this, and it angers him.
What is it that he's referencing? Because these dates don't make any sense. Like, this list has North Vietnam on it. North Vietnam, a country that was abolished, to then be replaced with Vietnam is on this list because it didn't exist anymore after the 2nd of July 1976. And he has this here in his list of failures, counting as a failure. When that's a resounding success, they won the war. It also has South Vietnam, the people who Vietnam fought against.
So this is actually a good point. Ultimately, the list that I took from, I didn't scrutinize every entry super closely. This was just a back-of-the-envelope calculation. And there are undoubtedly some entries that I would remove if I were to go and redo this in a more in-depth analysis. However, this fact of excluding this entry, or even a bunch of other entries, wouldn't really make any difference. And to explain why, we're going to do a short math lesson. Because here's the thing. If you were to remove that, you would remove it from the numerator and the denominator. So let's say we removed Vietnam from the list, okay? That fraction would go from 196 over 200, okay? Which equals 98% to 195 over 199, which equals 97.9%. The difference between 98% and 97.9% is utterly negligible, and it would have basically no effect on the overall point being made. In fact, even if we were to exclude 50 results, this would just become 146 over 150, which would equal 97.3%. 98%, 97.9%, 97.3%. It went down by 0.6% when we took out 50 examples. The reason the rate isn't going down by any considerable amount is because there are almost no survived states on the list. And I expect that after all is said and done and each erroneous inclusion is taken out, that the list would still be dominated by examples that have failed due to internal capitalist degeneration or external imperialist aggression or civil and ethnic strife. And there is no escape from this argument because you are never going to exclude enough examples to make 4 look good. And as we said, this isn't even really the success rate of these projects in achieving progress toward worker control. This is just the bare survival rate.
But even if it was true, 4 successes out of 196 failures is still an incredibly good record compared to absolutely anything else.
No, it absolutely isn't. Especially because I'm considering the 4 currently existing state capitalist nations' successes because of the incidental fact that they just so happen to be the ones that still exist. Any of these might fail in the future, and all of them appear to be degenerating into traditional private capitalism as we speak. There is a 0% success rate when it comes to making progress towards socialism using the state, and a roughly 2% success rate when it comes to bare survival. That is abysmal. You support projects which are literally incapable of making progress toward worker control and that have a very high failure rate, even though they have an extremely high birth rate. Unlike you, anarchists are honest about our failures. We know that we haven't survived external pressure, but we know that we can cite the furthest progress towards socialism in human history. If you'd like to learn more about how anarchists achieved that, you should learn about anarchist Spain during the Spanish Civil War.
And wouldn't it make sense that you, as someone who wants a better world, who wants things to be different, to say, you know what, I'm going to grit my teeth a little bit here and advocate for these projects and support them?
No, because I'm a revolutionary, not a reformist. I don't want more scraps from the table of my rulers. I want a transformation of economic and social conditions. This is why I'm also not spending my time running campaigns for DSA candidates, even though they would improve the conditions of the United States. Ultimately, they would only institute social democracy. I know you're very attached to these examples of social democracy across the planet and in history, but I care more for the people of the planet than to consign them to permanent proletarian status. I care about what method has made the most progress in moving us toward the abolition of class society, and that is, at present, anarchism.
While they exist, and fight against the forces that are trying to destroy them, because something that he seems to be allergic to mentioning is that every single one of the actual socialist, Marxist-Leninists, whatever you want to call them, projects, state socialists, state capitalists, whatever the fuck you want to call them, I honestly don't give a shit about the semantics. Pretty much all of them were destroyed as a result of mass outside interference.
Yes, that's exactly the point. Your ideology's entire argument for why it throws the movement of the masses under the bus and acts as a force of counter-revolution is that it will supposedly allow these nations to survive imperialism. But as you readily admit, it fails on that exact measure. They're constantly defeated by imperialism. Why are we throwing our revolutions into the meat grinder of state capitalism when it still fails to defeat imperialism? You're literally just unilaterally backing counter-revolution.
Outside interference emanating from the imperialist countries where anarchists like you mostly reside, because anarchism is overwhelmingly a first world phenomenon.
So it's absolutely true that there are a lot of anarchists in the first world. But the most significant anarchist movement on Earth right now is actually in Brazil, and that's the OSL. And I'm aligned with that movement ideologically, which bases its praxis in a form of anarchism called especifismo. If you'd like to learn more about the OSL, a link to their founding manifesto can be found in the description.
Because, I mean, if there was anything resembling genuine anti-imperialist, like large-scale anarchist society anywhere in the world that was fighting back against imperialism, you can bet that I would, be on their side.
So, as we see later in this video, that's just a blatant lie. Not only do you tarnish the memory of the Spanish revolutionaries who fought bravely against Franco, but you also lie about the Zapatistas, who've been resisting the United States and Mexico, trying to destroy them for decades. You're always on the wrong side of the issue. You support only state capitalism, even though it still fails against imperialism. And you lie about horizontalist attempts at socialism and communism, which resist the incursions of global capital and fascism.
Why wouldn't you acknowledge that? Why wouldn't you acknowledge, yeah, they were interfered with, they failed to resist imperialism? But, what does failure even mean here? Is, maintaining against all of the might of global imperialism, for example, a country like the USSR.
There's just tons of examples that they can point to, but the vast majority of them got destroyed either by imperialism, capitalist pressure, or internal degradation due to hierarchy producing more and more capitalist incentives internally, or degradation due to ethnic and civil strife. Those systems aren't more stable.
Okay, so I want to see the anarchist system that does better. I want to see this no hierarchy anarchist society that has done better than any of these other experiments that you're deriding here.
So this is one of my favorite parts of the video, because after all this sort of whiny rambling that he's been doing for 10 minutes, here I basically just address his entire critique in the original video. I regarded the reason that the project had failed, and that essentially just negated 10 minutes of him complaining. And his response is that he just immediately ignores it, pivots, and reframes. So all that preachy nonsense that he did there for 10 minutes basically just amounted to nothing. And this is how I know that Bad Empanada does not engage in good faith.
They are absolutely lying to people. And
I'm going to sit here in silence until he brings up that he thinks is what we should all be aiming for. That does work.
But of course, he doesn't wait. He knows that if he doesn't interrupt me constantly and present an opposition narrative to his audience, that they might actually absorb the critique that I'm making in the video and therefore develop a revolutionary orientation. And for those of you listening, you know that I've already done what he asked in this video. You might be saying to yourself, maybe he doesn't know about the Spanish anarchists during the Spanish Civil War, and you'd be wrong. Later, he'll admit that he knows about them, and so we know that he's been purposely omitting them from the conversation this entire time. Then he'll go on to tell lies and smear the memory of the great working masses, both proletarian and peasantry, which form together a comprehensive system of worker self-management unlike any seen in history and with nearly incomprehensible effectiveness.
So revolutionary Catalonia, which he's referring to, lasted for about 1 year, less than a year. from the 22nd of July 1936 to the 8th of May 1937. It only existed because there was a war going on where Soviet armed and backed forces were fighting against a reactionary like Franco faction of the Civil War. And in the midst of that, they proclaimed an autonomous region that lasted less than a year.
Oh, so you do know about examples. How odd. Just a moment ago, you were acting like you had no idea. So if I hadn't mentioned the furthest progress towards socialism in human history, you would have just pretended it never happened, huh? This demonstrates, once again, that Bad Empanada is not engaging in good faith. Also, I find this argument funny because you've just been complaining at length about how your examples of state capitalism are not actually failures because they were destroyed from the outside. We're meant to excuse those failures because they were only destroyed by imperialism. But now, when the example with the most extensive demonstration of decommodification, elimination of alienation, cooperative management of the means of production by the workers, and elimination of wage labor in human history is destroyed by the Hitler-aligned Franco and sabotaged and betrayed by the Bolsheviks, we're meant to forget their existence? Sorry, I don't think I'll be disregarding their sacrifices just so you can feel good about your fake anti-imperialism on the internet. Also, anarchists didn't only last a year. Some anarchist collectives outsurvived the Republican regions of Spain, ending only in 1939 with Franco's complete victory. Many cooperatives from before the war even survived into Franco's regime, surviving his attempts to destroy all of the cooperatives in Spain. And many anarchists continued armed resistance to the Franco regime for decades after the end of the Civil War, joining in with the Maquis guerrillas, especially those occupying Barcelona. This resistance didn't end until 1963, with the anarchist guerrillas in Barcelona being some of the very last holdouts against Franco. In fact, there are more surviving anarchist projects in Spain than there are communist regions in Russia. To this day, the anarchist influence has survived in a variety of ways, both direct and indirect. There are hundreds of social occupied centers in the urban areas of Spain and major cities, and libertarian or communal towns such as Marinaleda, Fraguas, Pumaredo, Lacabe, Ascurgi, Chiral, and Navalquejigo. You can excuse my pronunciation. But the anarchists were never eliminated in Spain and continued on as a guerrilla underground network that sprung right back up after Franco's regime faltered. Their influence has been permanent. Meanwhile, Russia is currently a fascist empire invading its neighbors and has purity police walking around harassing its people.
And if you believe any of what he said, like decommodification, workers' control of the means of production, any of that could have meaningfully been achieved in 10 months. I don't even know what to tell you. It obviously wasn't.
So here's Bad Empanada either outright lying or admitting that he's just completely ignorant on the subject. Passages were already provided earlier in the video demonstrating that, in fact, all of these things were achieved and to a much greater extent than any project he supports ever came close to achieving. He just can't imagine it because he's accepted all the propaganda from these state capitalist regimes that they couldn't do anything otherwise than they did. And you know, perhaps it's true. The state is, after all, incapable of instituting socialism. It would have to dissolve itself to create the political and economic structures that are necessary to empower the workers. Your state projects can't achieve those gains, but actual socialist revolutions can.
Calling Zapatistas anarchists is absurd.
You know, it's funny because I rewatched my video just to make sure, but there is no place in the video where I called the Zapatistas anarchist. I just don't understand, where do authoritarian leftists get these talking points? Are they sent like an email where they're just given all the same arguments? Because if you mention the Zapatistas to an authoritarian leftist, they immediately start screaming, but the Zapatistas aren't anarchist! I said the Zapatistas were an example of a horizontal revolution, not anarchism. You're the one who is narrowly preoccupied upon the results of anarchism because you're brain rotted by the internet. And for you, this is about a sectional rivalry, whereas I am instead concerned with the consideration of how the political and economic conditions of society are transformed completely, not merely reformed into a more palatable version.
The Zapatistas run a couple of municipalities.
Sure, you could say they run a couple of municipalities. Their population is estimated to be 200,000 people.
They are tolerated by the Mexican state because they are more efficient.
They are absolutely not tolerated by the Mexican state. The Zapatistas have been under siege since their inception. There was even a concerted effort between the American and Mexican government to destroy the Zapatista movement in the 90s, and it failed. The Mexican government has been giving the cartels carte blanche to attack the Zapatista territories. And they're building the Maya train through Zapatista territory on purpose as to try to foist capitalist imperatives on the Zapatista territory. Bad Empanada then goes on to ramble, telling lies or admitting his ignorance, pretending that the Zapatistas are Cuba on a small scale, neglecting to mention the caracoles, neglecting to mention sortition and rotation of delegates, neglecting to mention complete abolition of land ownership, neglecting to mention the direct distribution of agricultural goods. Complete slop.
I think what an authoritarian leftist considers a success is creating some form of polity that is different from the norm, that is different from the status quo, and they very much are different from the status quo regardless of how much you deny it.
Then they have a 100% failure rate, as was demonstrated earlier in the video.
That works explicitly for the purpose of attempting to materially benefit as many people as possible, rather than being driven by the class interests of the bourgeoisie.
This is, once again, the aim of social democracy. If all you want is reforms to make capitalism gentler, then you're not fighting for a revolutionary change in society. Revolutionary change will lead to the liberation of humanity, but it will never be had by fighting for bare improvements in conditions. Just go live in Sweden or Switzerland or Norway or something. So this is one of my favorite parts of the video, because Bad Empanada presses play on the video of me, and the recording responds to the response that he just made. And it's funny because it clearly disorients him, and he then proceeds to start projecting all of his own flaws onto me.
That is what most people would consider a success. And they have many examples of successes that have done exactly that. What would an anarchist consider a success?
Obviously, if you want to create a capitalist state, there's tons of examples of creating a capitalist state.
This guy just full snark, talks confidently and snarkily, doesn't try to honestly understand or honestly summarize the opinion of his opponents. Just they just want a capitalist state. It's that simple. There has to be a certain point where you're willing to at least somewhat accurately summarize what your opponents believe in, so then you can dismantle it honestly, because this is just straw manning.
Bad Empanada is full snark. He is confidently wrong. He is never charitable. He has no idea what his opponents think, and he has no desire to learn. Understandably, he now plays defense for the rest of the video.
Authoritarian leftism is super good at that, super good at creating capitalism and painting it red. But what anarchists, or horizontalists, I guess you would say, believe is a success is when the people are empowered. So we have different metrics. I actually want...
I would say that the people are very much empowered when they go from working for the bourgeoisie to living in a state that is, at least to an extent, an honest attempt to create something that explicitly benefits those people, that works on their behalf to benefit them. I'd say that is absolutely spinnable as a way of empowering the people.
I like how he describes this as spinnable as a way to empower the people, because he knows that it's not materially so. He knows exactly what it is that I'm expecting from these projects, because he knows that most of the most influential revolutionary theorists in history agree with me. But he's content not to ask for it, and he'll run interference and distortion campaigns to convince you that these projects deserve your full-throated support without criticism and without telling things how they are on their face. He knows you probably don't know the theory that was discussed in this video, and he doesn't want to tell you because he knows it would undermine all of the campus geopolitical arguments that he makes. He is not a revolutionary. He wants you to spend all your attention on matters that you have no control over, instead of organizing on the ground to change your conditions. The things he wants don't really empower you, and he knows that. So Bad Empanada then rants about how anarchism is a subculture for people who just want to look like they support good things and don't support bad things, when Bad Empanada literally does nothing in the real world. He's just an internet talking head who mostly makes slop content and has basically no theoretical knowledge. He's an opportunist politically and clearly quite manipulative. By contrast, most anarchists I know are active in the real world. Even when I have disagreements with their tactics, I have to credit them for at least doing something. Right now, Cuba has introduced a series of market reforms that move it further toward private capitalism and destroy even more of its state capitalist measures. This is Cuba caving further to imperialism. Authoritarian leftists will never, ever learn from these failures. They have 100 years of examples of this happening over and over and over again, and they just keep supporting state capitalism. By contrast, in the United States, anarchists are currently being jailed by the American government for being a threat to the fascist regime. For all your talk of supporting the people that are the most direct threat to the American empire out of lesser of two evilism, you seem to be quite willing to throw anarchists under the bus when they are being targeted for their threat to the American government. So that's about it for my response to Bad Empanada. I think, as you can see, there wasn't that much substance to it, but I want to thank Socialism for All once again for making such a well thought out response. Bad Empanada, I recommend BetterHelp. Just kidding, they'd never give an anarchist a sponsor. I rely on you all in order to make ends meet. If you want to support the work that I'm doing on this channel, please go over to my Patreon and become a patron for any amount. You could also do the same on YouTube using the members function. Also, don't forget that I'm on Means TV. If you use my affiliate code Anark, you can get a 20% discount on a subscription. If you support the channel and you don't have any money, please like the video, go down below and comment, and subscribe to the channel. Additionally, if you want to be notified when I release new videos about theory and praxis, go hit the notification bell. Anyway, I think that's about it for this one. Thanks for watching all this way. I'll see y'all next time.